Welcome back to Home Field Trivia for our Philadelphia Eagles quiz. Like and subscribe for more content. Leave a comment below. Thanks for joining us today. First question, the Eagles were founded in 1933. True or false? That is true. The Eagles won their first Super Bowl in 2017. That is true. The Eagles' current head coach is Nick Sirianni. That is true. The Eagles play their home games at Citizens Bank Field. That is false. The Eagles were the first team with cheerleaders. That is true. The Eagles have never had a 13-win regular season. That is false. The Eagles have a rivalry with the Dallas Cowboys. That is true. The Eagles have played in the Super Bowl 3 times. That is true. The Eagles' mascot is named Swoop. That is true. Clyde Simmons is the Eagles' all-time sack leader. That is false. Donovan McNabb played for the Eagles. That is true. The Eagles have had 25 players inducted into the Hall of Fame. That is true. Chuck Bednarik was known as Concrete Charlie. That is true. The Eagles' all-time leading rusher is LaShawn McCoy. That is true. The Eagles have won 3 NFL championships before the Super Bowl era. That is true. The Eagles have had 6 losing seasons in the last 20 years. That is false. The Eagles have never had a quarterback throw for over 5,000 yards in a season. That is true. The Eagles' first head coach was Greasy Neal. That is false. The Eagles have won the NFC East Division more than 10 times. That is true. The Eagles have never had a player win Defensive Player of the Year. That is false. Dick Vermeil led the Eagles to their first Super Bowl. That is true. The Eagles have retired the number 5 for Donovan McNabb. That is true. The Eagles' all-time leading receiver is Deshaun Jackson. That is false. The Eagles once had a quarterback named Ron Jaworski. That is true. The Eagles have hosted the Super Bowl once. That is false. Randall Cunningham punted for the Eagles in 1987. That is true. The Eagles have never beaten the New York Giants in a playoff game. That is false. The The Eagles have had multiple head coaches since 2000. That is true. The Eagles have played a game in London. That is true. The Eagles have had a player win Offensive Rookie of the Year. That is true. Thanks for joining us for our Philadelphia Eagles quiz. Like and subscribe for more content. Leave a comment below. See you next time.